Afghanistan is incredibly ethnically diverse, including ethnicities such as the Pashtun, the Tajik, the Hazara, the Uzbek, the Amak, the Turkmen, the Baloch, the Pashai, and the Nuristani, among others. In fact, the national anthem of Afghanistan mentions no fewer than 14 different ethnic groups, and we actually have a map right here. In the Kite Runner, Amir is a member of the Pashtun tribe, which is actually the largest tribe within Afghanistan. In fact, they constitute between 42 and 60% of the population. Now, these numbers aren't exact because the country hasn't actually been stable enough to host a census for over 30 years now, but they are by far the most populous ethnic group. They are traditionally the ruling class of Afghanistan, and they have been since the rise of the Hotaki dynasty in 1709, so over 300 years ago. Meanwhile, Amir's friend Hassan is a member of the Hazara tribe. They are the third most populous ethnic group within Afghanistan, and they constitute between 5 and 10% of the population. But they tend to gravitate towards urban centres, which makes them seem like a much higher percentage of the population than they actually are. The Hazaras, bit of background information, are thought to be descendants of Genghis Khan's army, and practice Shia Islam, whereas virtually every other ethnic group within Afghanistan, including the Pashtuns, practice a sect of Sunni Islam. This is one of the primary reasons for such a large societal divide, and is clearly evidenced in the Kite Runner. There was, and still is, significant inequality between the Sunni Pashtuns and the Shia Hazaras, and more than a small amount of racism. So the question is, how did this divide start? What is the fundamental difference between the Sunni and the Shiite Islamic sub-religions? Well, the story begins with the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the year 1632 AD. So the Prophet Muhammad, not pictured here, died in 632 AD. Now, the community of Muslims, of the very first Muslims that he lived in, which resided in what is present-day Saudi Arabia, had accepted the Prophet's authority without question. His word was absolute. However, he had failed to install in place a means of succession, as in, who on earth would replace him? And when he died, the community was divided on that issue. A vast majority of the members of that community believed that the community should decide on the leader, that the elites of the community should have the right to decide who is the best person to lead them, in a sort of proto-democratic format, but only for the upper classes. This group would become the Sunni Muslims. However, a smaller segment of this population believed otherwise. They believed that leadership could only be bestowed in a divine manner, and that leadership should remain within the family of the Prophet, and therefore power should go to Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali. And these were the forefathers of the Shia Muslims. Now, this political division rapidly developed into a full-out war, which divided the Muslims irrevocably. Ali was eventually killed, but his son Hussein continued on the war, and rejected the rule of the Caliph, which was the leader of the Sunni side of the war. The war ended when Hussein and 72 of his family members went to war against a large army of Sunni Muslims, and took on the large army of the Caliph, and were completely massacred. So the war ended. Now, if you look at the Christian divide between Catholicism and Protestantism, you would expect, as a template for these religious feuds, you would expect the next several centuries just to be filled with bloodshed and rivalry and hostility between the different factions of these religions. Based on the evidence, this is what you would expect to happen, but you would be entirely wrong. For the most part, nothing happened. I mean, the different sub-religions were adopted by different tribes in the region, which were constantly formed, divided, conquered, and destroyed, but they often inhabited remote regions and had very little contact with each other, or with anyone else for that matter. And thus it continued for many centuries. The Shia and the Sunni didn't necessarily get along, per se, and they generally viewed each other as religiously inferior, or, not a true Muslim, and they held each other in contempt, but at least they weren't fighting each other. Although the religions were scattered, though, they weren't scattered equally. As you can see here, a vast majority, that is, over 70% of Muslims are Sunni. However, there are several countries in the vicinity of Arabia which actually have a Shia majority. So we've got a map here that shows the relative distribution of different Islamic sects. Now, these religions were, for the most part, wholly unremarkable, or these regions were wholly unremarkable, until the turn of the 1900s, when oil started to become such a valuable resource, and the world's largest oil fields, most of them were discovered in the Middle East. Now, this caused a big political shake-up of the region. Suddenly, Europe's major superpowers began to take an interest in the region. It's a very long, bloody story, but the result was a major power shift in the Middle East. So, we've actually got a map here of oil distribution in the Middle East. So let's bring this first map across and put the second map over here. And just look at these two maps. And you can see how disproportionately large amount of the Shiite Muslims actually had a huge amount of the oil. So this was incredibly disproportionate. So the oil-rich regions started to become considerably more, A, rich, and B, industrialized, and C, protected by the Europeans. The Shia was suddenly disproportionately powerful in a region in which they were actually a massive minority in, and it was a region that was becoming increasingly unstable. When the European influence in the region declined after the World Wars, when they started giving these countries independence or trying to allow them to govern themselves, the region's centuries-old status quo collapsed almost entirely. The old resentments between the different facets of the religion suddenly flared up again, and political groups and movements, like the Taliban, started to gain traction and power. Now this was the era that the kite runner was set in. The elite of the Pashtuns, like Emir, were very wealthy, and the Pashtuns treated the Hazara as religiously inferior, or not really true Muslims. They were at the very bottom of the social ladder, and they tended to be blamed for the country's problems. When the Taliban took over, this was what gave them so much power and popularity. In some ways, it's similar to Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s, and the subsequent discrimination against the Jewish people. They were blamed for the problems, they were the scapegoats, and they were punished by society and driven out of society by public opinion as a result of that. Now this divide has a profound impact on the book. We see at times that Emir thinks of himself as superior to Hassan based on ethnicity, even though he himself recognizes that this attitude is wrong and incorrect. It's still present, and it's a reflection of the sentiments of the society. This attitude becomes a reason, and then later on a justification for his actions towards Hassan. This also works both ways. In a state built on apartheid or segregated values, it's very common for actually the suppressed population to believe and accept their supposed inferiority. This means that Hassan could have legitimately believed that Emir was a better person than him for being a Pashtun. Now this is really ironic. Consistently, Hassan treats Emir much better than Emir treats Hassan. Emir didn't intervene when Hassan got raped, and he later stole money and blamed it on Hassan. Hassan, on the other end, forgave Emir, took responsibility for stealing the money, which he clearly didn't do, out of respect to his friends, and continued to protect Emir's house when the Taliban took over, taking a massive risk that ended up costing him his life. And yet, at the end, he still considered Emir to be his truest friend. It's interesting that because they both thought Emir was the better person, Hassan acted so much better and more admirably and was the better person. Today, there is very little improvement in the Middle East. The religious divides run deep and the region continues to remain unstable. Meanwhile, groups like the Taliban still have a lot of support from segments of the local population, and it's very difficult to get them under control. In conclusion, I would argue that the divide in Afghan culture had a major impact on the plot of the book. It really helped define the relationship between Emir and Hassan, which in turn set up the entire plotline of the book. So now, let's have a very quick question and answer period.